So my talk, the focus of my talk today is on the post-war, post-1945 French family planning movement. That is to say, Maternité Heureuse, an organization that was created in, excuse me, there's something wrong with the, an organization that was created in 1956 by a group of professional women, many physicians, including sociologist Evelyne Sulero and gynecologist Marie-Andrée Lagroix-Velle-Hallé. And this organization then was reconstituted in 1960 as Mouvement Français pour le Planning Familial. And so throughout this talk, I will refer to mostly to the latter of these two organizations, and I will, for reasons of brevity, I will refer to it as MFPF. So that's the Mouvement Français pour le Planning Familial. So these organizations were the main actors, the main social actors in France, advocating for legal reform in the realm of contraception, so for the legalization of contraception, but also more widely, they were key actors in disseminating a culture of more open debate on family life and on sex, and played a key role in the legalization then eventually of birth control as it occurred through the Loi Neurit of 1967. So my talk is really can be divided into three sections. I will start firstly by talking a little bit about the state of the scholarship on the history of family planning movements, both in France and internationally. In the second part, I will talk a little bit about sort of the key kind of discursive and practical aspects and strategies of the family planning movement in France, and focusing specifically on the question of responsibilization of individuals and of couples in reproductive choice. And then in the third section, which is really the bulk of my recent and original research is located, in this third section, I will focus on how the French family planning movement approached and related to and also perceived immigrant communities in France in the long 1960s. So research into post-1945 French family planning is very rich. But until recently, it was framed in most cases nationally in relation to national demographic discourse and cultural and national level cultural change on sex and gender. Work by Bibia Pavard, but also by Caroline Rusterholz, has changed this, as they have demonstrated the extent to which French family planners were shaped by practices and discourses produced by internationally operating US and UK-based organizations, such as the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which I will refer to in this talk as IPPF, the Population Council, but also the British Family Planning Association. And at the global level, also the scholarship on family planning, post-1945 family planning is really thriving in recent years. And very generally speaking, this scholarship, kind of global history scholarship on family planning, focuses on what we now call the global South, on the recently, in that period, recently decolonized nations. And very generally, it presents family planning, or it understands family planning as a discursive and practical framework which facilitated an array of interventions by state and non-state actors in individuals' intimate practices and knowledge. As is now well established, post-45 family planning was a transnational movement responding to, first and foremost, to decolonization and embedded in the globalization of demographic debate, and more specifically, the fear for what was referred to commonly in the Western world in the 60s as a population bomb. And I refer here to, and many of you will be familiar with this, the middle image, which really most kind of strongly represents this fear or this discourse of global overpopulation as a problem, a discourse that was particularly pronounced during the long 1960s in the Western world, in the US, but to some degree also in Western Europe. And so the notion that there is specifically that there's problematically high fertility in the so-called developing world, and that this is actually one of the key, if not the key, global problems that the world faces at this point in time. So recent studies on family planning programs in the post-colonial developing world stress the hierarchization, the social hierarchization of reproductive bodies according to race, locality, social class, and ability. Now, this notion of social hierarchization informs also my approach, and I build on some of these works, on the global South. And so what it refers to, in my understanding, is the belief that some bodies are more worthy of procreation than others. Some individuals are more clearly endowed with the capacity to make informed, rational, and autonomous choices with regard to family size, parenthood, and sexual behavior. And so one of the things I will be arguing today is that in the construction of a modern reproductive agent, as the French and other European family planning movements do at this point in time, so it's really the construction of what they see as a modern reproductive agent, a modern reproductive agency by individuals and by couples, and also in their construction of what they call responsible parenthood. In these key notions, there is always this element, one can see implicitly or even explicitly sometimes, this element of social hierarchy. And so this is what I'm interested in my research and in my talk today, is that specifically what can we learn from the approaches specifically by the French family planning movement, the approaches vis-a-vis those who they saw as situated in the margins of reproductive autonomy, in the margins of reproductive agency, as they saw the problematic margins of reproductive agency and individual agency, those for whom at least in their minds, it wasn't clear whether these individuals, whether these reproductive agents actually had a clear or were capable of making clear, rational, and autonomous choices. And so what I will attempt to do today is to juxtapose the French family planners' notions of reproductive agency as they applied it to the French-born population in mainland France on the one hand, where, as I say, there's the construction of this, as they saw it, modern reproductive individual agency, contrasting that with their approaches vis-a-vis these, what one might call these, what they saw as these problematic margins, those who they saw as being in the margins of that notion of agency. And there are a number of groups that one could look at, but the groups that I will focus on today for my talk are immigrant groups, North African immigrant groups, specifically North African immigrant communities in Paris, because there's a number of initiatives that the French family planning movement undertook vis-a-vis North African immigrant communities in France during the 1960s. So, as I said earlier, I believe that a global historical approach is required to address these questions. This needs to be looked at in a global sense. As I said earlier, because the French family planning movement formed part of transnational networks and was influenced by them, but also because the global scholarship really offers us these key concepts which we like, such as social hierarchization. So before discussing MFPF in a little bit more detail, I'll just give a little bit more background as to the global context and the global historical approach. So the transnational networks that Maternité Heureuse and then MFPF formed part of emerged after the Second World War in the form of initially private associations based in primarily the US and to a lesser degree the UK. So these included the Population Council set up by J.D. Rockefeller III in 1952 in New York, and IPPF created in the same year in London by Margaret Sanger, among others. And by 1960, these transnational networks involving philanthropists, physicians, scientists, campaigners had grown into a powerful, in the words of historian Mark Frey, a powerful epistemic community with over 30 national groups affiliated, programs in all continents, and growing influence also in the United Nations system. While encompassing a multitude of actors and approaches, very generally speaking, the transnational family planning movement was centered on the normalization of the small nuclear family, the quote-unquote modernization of sexual practices, and crucially the lowering of fertility in developing countries on the basis of a neo-Malthusian analysis, and this relates back to the notion of the population bomb, on the basis of a neo-Malthusian analysis that problematically high fertility in the developing world was a key problem, causing all sorts of other socio-economic and political problems. So in a number of cases, as is now well documented, including, for example, India, Kenya, family planning programs involved coercive practices such as unconsented abortion, unconsented sterilization, or insufficient information in the administering of contraceptives, and specifically the IUD. So I won't say much more about this now, but there's another kind of story in terms of how these problems around human rights, what then in the 70s came to be referred to as the human rights abuses in family planning were discussed in the United Nations and in various agencies in the United Nations from the late 60s and throughout the 70s, and this becomes a huge area of debate. But this goes slightly beyond the time frame I'm looking at, so we can talk about it in the discussion if people are interested. So Maternité Heureuse was affiliated with IPPF in 1958, and then IPPF representatives also attended MFPF's founding meeting. As argued by Bibia Pavard, during the following years, MFPF underwent an encompassing advocacy transfer from IPPF. So its affiliation with IPPF gave it a huge deal of legitimacy, expert legitimacy in the French context and internationally, but on a more practical level, also IPPF supported the MFPF financially, educationally, with lots of transfer of books and reports and research, and also on a very basic practical level in terms of sending supplies of contraceptives to France, which was part also of the relationship. But as again, Pavard and others have noted, there's one particular aspect in which the French movement was really distinct and did not agree with the approaches taken by organizations such as IPPF. And that is to say, MFPF, or the French family planning movement, was unwilling to challenge the strong pro-natalist consensus in France up until the mid-1960s. So France, as I imagine a number of you will know, after the Second World War had a very, very strong, in terms of political and public discourse, a very strong pro-natalist consensus, stronger than was the case in Britain, for example, stronger than was the case in Italy, really a particularly strong pro-natalist consensus. This, of course, poses a huge problem to the family planning movement, which is advocating for smaller families, for contraception, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, MFPF understands that it is not possible to openly really break this consensus or openly challenge this pro-natalist consensus. And so it takes a quite cautious line in terms of demography. It's not going to argue that France needs fewer children. It certainly does not argue that. And instead, what it does, in order to kind of avoid being accused of neo-Malthusianism, in order to avoid being accused of anti-natalism, instead what it does is it calls for, or it centers its message on a notion of responsible parenthood, this notion of responsibility, that it is up to individuals and married couples to responsibly choose the right family size for themselves. And that doesn't necessarily mean smaller families. And that is certainly, as they keep on saying, that is certainly not an anti-natalist argument, an anti-natalist position. And so up until the late 60s, MFPF really cultivates actually a pro-family image. And this also really is distinct in terms of, is distinct to the French family planning movement compared to other the situation in other countries, that it really quite explicitly cultivates this pro-family image, emphasizes the notion of family well-being, and foregrounds the notion of the desired child as central to family well-being. So this is noted in scholarship, that this is a particular French situation whereby even those advocating birth control and legal birth control and the use of birth control could not break with the pro-natalist consensus. At the same time, what I argue is that despite the national aversion to neo-Malthusianism, in French too, family planners, demographers, and politicians came under the spell of the doctrine of global overpopulation, but global overpopulation specifically as a problem located in the global south, not in Europe. So in an internal MFPF report of 1966, which discussed UN publications and research, quote unquote, galloping demographic growth was termed to be, or was seen as, the world's chief #1 global problem. And the specter of environmental destruction, famine, and even cannibalism was evoked in this MFPF report of '66. And despite the fact that MFPF had major disagreements with the National Institute for Demography, INED, the very influential French National Institute for Demography, so MFPF had major disagreements with INED regarding the situation in France, because INED had been the institute that since '45 had advocated pronatalism and the need for pronatalist policy. So they were on very different positions with regard to, or on different positions with regard to the situation in France. But in terms of the international situation, INED, so the Institute for Demography, and MFPF actually really find themselves and both really share this specter and this doctrine or this ideology of global overpopulation in the developing, as a problem in the developing world. So, for instance, in a television broadcast of 1960 of the popular TV show Faire Face, there was a discussion between Lagroix, one of the two founding members of the organization who I mentioned earlier, between Lagroix and Alfred Sauvy, the director of INED, where they both comment on and agree on the alarming global population numbers combined, and this was combined with images of masses of starving African children. But more generally also, MFPF contrasted the situation in France, where it, as I said, where it carefully distanced itself from any anti-natalist perspective, contrasts that with calls for population control in the developing world. So in that sense, in terms of calling for population control in the developing world, IPPF, the French family planning movement is clearly aligned with IPPF, for example, with the Population Council. So the views of family planners and demographers in this period cannot be reduced simply to pro or anti-natalist arguments. Rather, they were underpinned by another question: who ought to be encouraged to procreate and who ought to be discouraged to procreate? So this narrative of global overpopulation that we see also in the French family planning movement actually was strengthened or amplified. The attempts that had occurred since the 1950s, the attempts by the French authorities in the overseas departments, which in French are referred to commonly as the dom-toms, so the overseas departments, since the 1950s, the French authorities had actually implemented anti-natalist policies, which there's a lot of very interesting, or some very interesting and important research on this very recently. So in the dom-toms, in the overseas departments, specifically Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Antilles, in the Caribbean, but also the Isle of Réunion in the Indian Ocean. In these regions, French authorities had actually implemented anti-natalist policies after 45, strikingly in contrast or in tension with the pro-natalism in mainland France. So there's important work recently by Myriam Paris, also an article by Michel Zancarini-Fournel. Paris has worked on the case of Réunion and has looked at these anti-natalist policies actually meant. In her work, Paris, of course, builds on the groundbreaking, very important study by Françoise Vergès, who was, I think, the first to really in-depth analyze the cases of thousands of Black women in Réunion, on the Isle of Réunion, to have been involuntarily sterilized or undergone abortion by French medical officials in the 60s and into the 70s. So Vergès, I have here on the right, you see here the cover of Vergès is, I think, one of the first to really in detail document this. And so Myriam Paris builds on that and analyzes what these anti-natalist policies meant on the ground. Zancarini-Fournel has done something similar, or is doing something similar for the cases of Guadeloupe and Martinique. But in the latter case, the conclusion seems to be that although there too there was an attempt by local colonial authorities to implement a number of anti-natalist policies, including the spread of contraception, but that in Guadeloupe and Martinique, that seems to have been far less successful than it was in Réunion. So that's kind of ongoing research, very exciting research, I think, that's happening at the moment. This research is important to me as it introduces the category of race in wider narratives of post-war sexual change, and it also allows us to think about race and about social hierarchization of reproductive bodies also within mainland France, which is what I will talk about today. So just before I do so, just a couple of general points with regard to MFPF's activities and also its ideology. Centrally important to the French family planning movement was the battle to abolish a law dating from 1920, banning the sale and advertising of contraception with the exception of condoms, and criminalizing really any kind of what was termed anti-conception propaganda. The strong pro-natalist consensus after 45 meant that this law remained in place. And of course, as I said earlier, it presents the movement with a very hostile legal and cultural climate. The considerable, though declining, social power of the Catholic Church too hindered public advocacy for birth control. And in response, what MFPF tries to do is that it aims to disseminate really a broad culture of family planning, of what it terms responsible parenthood, which it sees as a process, part of a wider process of secularization, of modernization, involving a reshaping of the population's views on family, sex, health, morality, and individual freedom. MFPF's arguments in favor of birth control were a mix of notions of family and national well-being, and a differentiated, and this I think is important, a differentiated and normative view on the right family size. So it starts to really develop this idea that there are differentiated correct family sizes for different sections of, or different sectors of the population. So after 1960, INED, the National Institute for Demography, in fact introduced this notion of family optimum. That is to say that depending on one's socioeconomic situation, there would be an optimal family size. It's important that INED introduces this notion after 1960 because it replaces its earlier, more kind of blanket pronatalism, the earlier blanket pronatalism of the 1950s, whereby INED had kind of foregrounded this notion of demographic optimum. That is to say that as a nation, one needs to look at the macro level and the correct demographic level that France needs in order to thrive. From the 60s, it moves away from this and introduces this more differentiated idea of family optimum according to socioeconomic conditions. And that really chimes with MFPF's notion of responsible parenthood, as I said earlier. So the idea that as a married couple, because it's always about married couples in this context, as a married couple, one needs to make responsible choices about the right family size. But what's important about this also is that this is not only about your individual agency and your individual choice, but it is also that one has, in making this choice, one has a responsibility vis-a-vis the nation. So in this notion of responsible parenthood, there is also this notion, this element of almost being accountable vis-a-vis the nation, that it is one's responsibility to make the right choice, not only for one's own well-being or health, or the health of one's family, but also vis-a-vis the health of the nation. One needs to make those correct choices. So in that sense, I think there is the reproductive agency and autonomy that is proposed here is normative. And there's this normative dimension, that there's always this sense that certain choices are better than others, to put it simply. And again, depending on socioeconomic context. And so, and of course, in terms of families at a lower economic level or poorer families, the idea always being that smaller choice, that poorer families really need to make choices, need to make a small family choice. So at the same time, I would say, we do in the 60s see a real language of individual rights and liberté emerging in terms of procreative choice. But what I would argue, but this is an area that requires more research, is what I would argue is that it is really on the ground, on the level of kind of the practical work that the family planning clinics were doing. I think it's on the ground on that level that language and that idea of individual rights and liberté in the French sense, liberté in terms of procreation, emerges. As I say, I think more research needs to be done that would involve really also, for example, interviewing, speaking with people who worked at those clinics. But just to give a little bit more detail or context on the family planning clinics, which really were the main area of activity of the movement. So in the early and mid 60s, MFPF really focuses on creating a network of local clinics to provide private assistance to married couples. And by 65, it had created around 50 clinics around the country with over 400 medics prescribing, either directly handing out contraceptives or prescribing them or sending couples to other medics of whom they knew would illegally sell contraception. So obviously all this was illegal up until 1967. And again, I think my hypothesis, but this is something that requires further research, my hypothesis that it is in this context and in conversations with couples who visit these clinics that notions of individual reproductive agency really come to the foreground. A similar language of individual liberty, as it emerges at this time, a similar language of individual liberty in reproduction frames the Loi Neuwirth. The Loi Neuwirth, named after Lucien Neuwirth, who was the Gaullist member of parliament who had been campaigning for the legalization of contraception for a number of years. And then eventually this law is passed in 1967. The law establishes family planning as a cornerstone of French demographic health and welfare policies. It legalized the production and the sale of all forms of contraception, as well as the advertising, but with the exclusion of messages that could be deemed anti-natalist propaganda. So this is still limited in some regards. Liberalization was also limited in the fact that the pill became legal only for married women and was for now not free of charge, but that changes later on. It's very interesting to read not only the law itself, of course, but also Neuwirth's report to the Assemblée Nationale, to the parliament in 1966. So Neuwirth was tasked with setting up an expert commission which would investigate the impacts in a number of areas, the impacts of the legalization of contraception. So he creates this commission, and then in 1966 he presents the reports, and then there is a parliamentary discussion that follows. And one of the things that's interesting about the kind of the values and the language that is used is that, well, first of all, that this reveals the great extent to which Neuwirth was influenced by the family planning movement. And he was, in fact, he stood close to a number of leading figures, such as Pierre Simon in the family planning movement. And also that he's really influenced by this notion of responsible parenthood in this normative version, in this normative interpretation, as I mentioned earlier, responsible parenthood, but also the discourse of stable families and also of modern families, this kind of modernization discourse that accompanies all of this. So, and I have an image here of, I realize it's not very sharp. I mean, these are the photos that one takes in an archive. But so the image in the middle is the front page of Neuwirth's report. And then on the right, what we see is the front page of the second part of the report. And so the second part of Lucien Neuwirth's report, also the second part of the law, actually, the text of the law, talks about la liberté des individus. So there we really clearly see this language of individual liberty and individual freedom and agency in reproductive choice coming to the foreground. This is the second part of the report. The first part of the report is all about demography. So Neuwirth and his commission have to spend pages and pages and pages arguing that legalizing the pill is not going to lead to a demographic shortage, basically. It's not going to push France back into its historical problems with demographic shortage or perceived problems with demographic depopulation and so on. So the first part of the report is all about arguing that the demographic impact is not going to be negative for France, and that in fact by the 60s now the effects of the baby boom are starting to be felt, and so we need to think about France's demography in a different way. So it's still all very much about demography. But we do now get this second part of the argument, the second part of the report that talks about individual liberty in a way that I think is new. I think is historically new at this point, at least in the French context. So this emergence of a notion of reproductive liberty and autonomy, if you like, sat hand in glove with the feminization of family planning and the feminization of reproductive choice, the feminization of reproductive choice in public and political discourse. Women, specifically women as reproductive agents, were at the center of media debates and parliamentary debates around 1967, around the introduction of the law. And then the Loi Neuwirth itself cemented the idea of women's responsibility for birth control in public consciousness, I would argue. There's a lot more that could be said about feminization. Many of you will know there's a huge debate around this also for a whole number of other countries around. So the feminization of birth control choices within couples, in the private sphere, in the intimate sphere throughout the 20th century. So I don't have time to go into all of this, but again, if people want to talk about this, we can do it. But what I'm interested here is in the political articulation. So there would be, there would be this kind of private element of feminization whereby the question is it increasingly women making those decisions or being important in these decisions in the private setting? But this is really about the political articulation of this, and that in media and political discourse, by 1967 in France, it is all about women. And in fact, it's interesting to see how in the parliamentary debates that this is an aspect that actually unites the advocates of legal birth control and the opponents of legal, of whom there are still many, the opponents of legal birth control. This is actually an aspect that unites them, because both the advocates and the opponents really talk about women. They both frame this in terms of women's choices, but also in terms of women's sexual morality, women's bodies, women's social roles, women as mothers, and so on and so forth. So this is, I think, very interesting. However, and this brings me really to what I want to, what I've been looking at recently in terms of my own research. I would say that these new discourses about liberty, responsibility, but specifically women's liberty and responsibility was normative, yeah? Because this notion of responsible motherhood and responsibilizing women was or implied that women ought to make certain choices over others. For example, less children rather than more children, depending on socioeconomic circumstances. The responsibilization of women in this context, I would argue, went hand in hand again with the hierarchization of women. That is to say that there's a normative view on who is this woman, who is this responsible woman who is able to make those choices. She requires certain characteristics. She requires a certain mindset. So there's, I would say again, there's a normative view on who is this modern responsible woman who is able and informed and able to make those individual choices. So, and then this brings me to my final part of the talk, and really what I've been looking at recently, which is MFPF's specific activities or attempts to engage with immigrant communities in France. So MFPF and French society at large interpreted the principle of women's reproductive autonomy differently with respect to differently situated social groups. MFPF's actions vis-a-vis immigrant families in the 1960s, I would argue, were informed by wider societal discourses on the consequences of immigration from the former colonies, marked by disputes over cultural assimilation, economic impact, and demography. Issues of race, immigration, fertility, and the very nature of the French nation had been intimately connected in political discourse since the late 19th century. And this has been analyzed, I think, very thoroughly by Nimisha Barton and also Elisa Camicholi for the earlier period, late 19th century, and then up to 1945. What I would argue then is that after the Second World War, although these connections were still very strong in political discourse, these connections between race, immigration, and fertility were still very strong, but there are important shifts as immigration from the former colonies or the colonies, especially specifically North Africa, increased steadily. So after the decolonization of North Africa, and specifically at the end of the Algerian War in 1962, there was growing concern regarding immigration in public and political discourse, articulated specifically through images of hypersexualized and violent Arab men. The Pompidou governments, who were in power between 62 and 68, discouraged North African families from settling in France, and when they did settle in France, pressurized them into assimilation. And all this accompanied by the heavy rhetoric of modernity and civilization. Family immigration from the Maghreb remained relatively low until 75. And then in 75, the government adopted the policy of family reunion, but that is, sort of goes beyond the scope of this, that's a different story. But so up until 75, family immigration from the Maghreb remained relatively low, but despite these relatively low numbers, discourses framing high fertility among North African immigrants as a problem were widespread in 1960s France. So there's a lot of discussion about this sort of high fertility among North African immigrant communities, and that is a problem for France. The recent scholarship, for example, people like Amelia Lyons have argued that state welfare involving areas such as housing and child benefits laid bare the mechanisms of exclusion of post-colonial immigrant groups in this period, and that this was based on ethnicity and culture rather than citizenship status. And this specifically because after the end of the Algerian War, Algerians in France a number of Algerians in France, a good number of Algerians in France, took French citizenship, but as been argued by Lyons and others, in terms of these family and welfare policies, that didn't actually matter. So the way the state approached these people was as immigrants, even if they had French citizenship. So I propose that family planning formed part of this wider picture of welfare initiatives, treating immigrant families as a problematic category, distinct from the white French population, and this regardless of their actual citizenship status. So discussions of sort of problematically high fertility among these, specifically among North African immigrant communities, were also really widespread in MFPF publications at this point, and also kind of the discourses around or kind of discussions around the lack of use of birth control by these families or by these couples. And so MFPF attempts to create clinics, or has the plan to create clinics specifically designed for immigrant families in Paris and elsewhere. But before it embarks on this, it undertakes a number of research. So there's a number of research kind of initiatives that are being undertaken by MFPF, a number of surveys. And so what I'd like to do in the remaining couple of minutes that I have is just look at some of these. Look at the, yeah, 5 minutes, thank you. Look at the most important, I think, of these various kind of research initiatives that were taken. So I think the most extensive one, or influential one, was carried out by a woman called Cécile Goldet in Paris in 1962. So it's important to note, well before legalization. She interviews men and women, but mostly women, in the Paris immigrant communities of Algerians, Italians, and Portuguese. She concludes that there is, generally speaking, among these families, very little knowledge and use of modern contraception, but she does not compare this to the French population. She does not, so there's no discussion as to how this is actually compared to the French population. Of course, this is well before legalization, so it was hard to get reliable information around, on the rest of the French population. She also concludes that, one of the key questions was, by migrating, say, for example, from Algeria to France, by migrating, do these couples also adopt a small family model, which is referred to in this kind of publication as the European model or the modern model? And so that was one of the key questions of the research. And if they don't do this, why don't they do this? And there the conclusion is that no, they don't move to this model in terms of their values, and that most of these families, and specifically the Algerian families, continued to favor larger families. And so this is seen as a demographic problem. This is then framed by Goldet and in the discussions as a demographic problem for France, regardless of actual fertility rates, because in terms of the actual fertility rates, these were not much higher than was the case for the French population at large. So the problem here was the model, was the values around large families in the immigrant communities. I know there's not much time left, but just to follow up on this, I'm just trying to go to my next screen. Oh, come on. Okay. No, excuse me, I'm just trying to go to the final screen, but something is blocked. Okay. Okay. Yes. So the research by Goldet was influential. It provoked all sorts of discussions, not only in MFPF, but in the international family planning movement as well. So IPPF, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, was very interested in this kind of research. And then in the late 60s, starts to embark on a number of research initiatives that it itself conducted, mainly in Paris among immigrant communities. And there again, and actually in a more pronounced way, what we see in the IPPF research in the late 1960s among immigrant communities is that very clearly this grand narrative of modernization, the need for modernization of these communities, and that women will be the privileged actors, privileged actors of this kind of modernization and cultural transformation of these communities, and that the privileged terrain through which these communities will be modernize is through regulating their fertility and through adopting the small family model. So this takes on a very strong, wider cultural meaning, and the adoption of the small family model. Importantly, this will be my final point. Importantly, I think in this research, it's very clear, or the conclusions, one of the conclusions is that contraceptive use, and meanwhile, of course, contraception has been legalized, contraceptive use, as is concluded by the research, is not significantly lower than it is in the French-born population. And I think that's interesting and important. Yet at the same time, the research also concludes that it's not lower, while it's not lower than in the French-born population, the lack of contraceptive use is a big problem, and which requires immediate intervention. Another conclusion is that again, as Goldet had also argued, that in these communities there still is a stronger desire for large families. So large families continue to be a norm, and that's a problem that we need to address. But I think importantly, the research concludes that there is a stronger desire for large families in the older age groups, and among the younger age groups, the younger immigrant couples, there was not much difference in terms of the values of the French-born population. So one could conclude from that actually the problem is resolving itself, and we see that there's a rapid development towards adoption of, if you like, sort of natural adoption of a small family model. And nonetheless, IPPF still concludes that there is an urgent need for intervention. The final conclusion also is that, so they asked people about the numbers of actual children and also their numbers of desired children. And what the research found was that the numbers of actual children and the numbers of desired children were very close to one another, suggesting that these couples themselves, or many of these couples themselves, were actually satisfied with their own birth control arrangements. And again, nonetheless, IPPF constructs this as a problem. So, and I think that's important in terms of reproductive agency, because what we see here is that in terms of agency, you ask people what is their desired number of children, and people seem to be quite satisfied with the size of their family. And nonetheless, IPPF is then going to argue that there is a problem. So what I argue on this basis, with this kind of perception, this kind of research, is really the overall, I think, tendency here was an antinatalism. So the continued antinatalism in the non-white or non-French-born population, I think, emerges more clearly so from the IPPF research than from the French family planning research. But still, I think, generally speaking, that was the general kind of framework with which the problem was approached. And I realize I've run out of time, so I'm going to end here. I had a few concluding points, but we can talk about this maybe. So thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize for going over time with a few minutes.